Hello, I'm Brenton Prosser, Director of NatSem. Welcome to our first NatSem online seminar entitled The Impact of COVID-19 and Policy Response on Australian Income Distribution and Poverty, which will be presented by Professor Jinjing Li. Before speaking to this presentation and some practical matters, I'd like to acknowledge that presentation is being made on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians and owners of these lands and waters on which we gather. I pay my respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're joined by many who reside in other traditional lands. Today we have over 80 registered attendees, including from the US, Canada and South Africa. I'd like to also extend our acknowledgement and respect to the First Nations peoples of those lands, as well as all First Nations people who join us today. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Jinjing Li. Many of you know Jinjing and his work. Many of you will notice that his title has changed, and it's my pleasure to congratulate him on his well-deserved promotion to Professor at this, his first NatSem public event as a professor. And with the federal budget less than 2 weeks away, I can promise you'll be seeing him again soon. Now, for those who do not know Jinjing, his contribution to our economic micro-simulation model, STINMOD Plus, is substantial and underpins much of NatSem's work. STINMOD Plus is a tax transfer model that enables NatSem to model the impact of new and related policy scenarios on tax and welfare outcomes. Jinjing is an internationally recognised expert in microsimulation modelling and serves as a board member of the International Microsimulation Association. Jinjing continues to contribute to cutting-edge innovations, and as today's presentations will show, he's a leader in developing methodologies to respond to what can only be termed unique times. I'd also like to address some practical matters. Due to the number of people joining us today, we've adopted the Microsoft Live format. Amongst its benefits are the capacity to host large groups and manage multiple interactions. Amongst its limitations is that while you'll be able to see the presenters, it doesn't show all of the participants in today's session on the screen. Neither will be using the chat function. What we request is that you contribute your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your screen. Our colleague, Associate Professor Yogi Vidyatma, will collate these and publish them to recognise the contributions and for me to share those questions with Jinjing and you all. Should we not get to all the contributions, we'll publish everyone's question and respond by group email in coming days. We'd also encourage you to provide feedback on this working paper, as this is one of the primary purposes of this presentation. And we'll share this feedback with you in emails in coming days as well. Now, we also suggest that you do not click on the play button near the bottom of your screen, as we're recording this presentation and it will take you back to the start. So if in doubt, click on live. And on a final practical note, we'd encourage you to follow NatSem on Twitter to keep up with future events like this one as they develop in coming months. So now let's turn to today's presentation. This presentation describes a near real-time analysis of the income distribution effects of the COVID-19 crisis in Australia. It pays particular attention to changes in income distribution and the impact on income inequity. In doing so, it also considers the impact of federal government JobKeeper, JobSeeker and childcare policies. While it does not speculate on the future impact of recent changes to these policies, it does provide a clear and concise analysis of the impact between February and June this year. So now with that introduction, it's my pleasure to hand over to Professor Jinjing Li to present on the topic of the impact of COVID-19 and policy response on Australian income distribution and poverty.
Thank you, Brenton. Yeah, so today I'm going to present our latest working paper on the impact of COVID-19 and policy response on Australian income distribution and poverty. As you can see in the slides, we have a working paper available for download if you're interested in the full text. Okay, without further ado, let's get started. Okay. So to start with, COVID-19 is one of the largest socioeconomic shocks in Australia in recent years. So on the right-hand side, I put a slide, a figure on the seasonally adjusted unemployment rate since 2001. And as you can see that the major shocks we have experienced in the last 2 decades, the global financial crisis, which is marked around 2008 to 2009 this period, and also the COVID shock here, which is around March, April this year. So definitely, if you look at the magnitude, the COVID shock has increased the unemployment rate by around 2.5 percentage points, while the global financial crisis lifted up by less than 2 percentage points. So it looks like COVID is one of the largest shocks we have seen in Australia in the last 2 decades. And another reason why we look at a shock is that historically shocks tend to unevenly distributed and have a profound impact on the income distribution. So after recent shocks, say the global financial crisis, depending on which country you live in some countries there has been experience of the increase in inequality, and in some countries there's hardly any change because of the dramatic government response, and there's some countries even there's a slight decline. In the case of Australia, because of the top end of the income distributions were more affected by the global financial crisis, as their income were more likely to derive from the investment return. If we go back to the history a bit further, look at the Asian financial crisis back in the 1997, a number of countries actually experienced a sharp increase in the income inequality. So what's going to happen today? So that's the primary purpose of the paper. We want to estimate the impact of the COVID-19 on the Australian income distribution. And we want to focus on the income inequality as measured by Gini, which is one of the most common income inequality measures. And we also want to have a look at the poverty rates, with the poverty line set at 50% of the median equivalized disposable income at a pre-COVID level. So we want to actually compare whether the poverty has changed because of the shocks from the COVID. So not only we're interested in the total change due to the COVID, we're also interested in to what extent the change was contributed by the income shock itself, that is due to the COVID-19 and its public health response associated with the COVID, and also to what extent the policy effect contributed to the change. By policy effect, we're referring to a range of the measures that have taken place since March this year, aimed at protecting the jobs and aims to also lifting the living standard of the poorest and the most vulnerable household in Australia. So that involves a number of welfare policy change and the labor market policy change. The purpose of this paper is to look at the short-term impact. By short-term, we're looking at approximately 3 to 4 months after the initial outbreak in Australia. So to do this, we adopt a very intuitive decomposition framework. If you look at this graph that I put on the slides, we can think of the total change in any income inequality measure or in any measures of the income distributions. So the total change can be calculated by measuring, for instance, the Gini after the COVID and minus the Gini coefficient before the COVID. So that was a straightforward way of understanding the total change. And we add an extra term in there, which is the measure after COVID if there was no policy change. So this is just imagine a scenario where the COVID has hit.
I don't see a Binagopala Jinjing in your contacts.
Oh, sorry about that.
Who would you like to call?
Sorry about that. So imagine a scenario where there is a COVID and there's a associated public health response, but there is no.
Sorry, I missed what you said. I don't see a Binagopala Jinjing in your contact. Who would you?
Okay. All right. So imagine a scenario where there is a COVID and public health response, but there is no welfare supports for the people who lost their jobs, and also there's no policy attempt to save the jobs, as in the JobKeeper program in Australia. There's a no wage subsidy. So the difference between that scenario, if you let the COVID run but no response, and what we observed before the COVID, that would be the changes entirely attributed to the income shock effect associated with COVID. If on the other hand, the other part of the equation, which is the income measured after the COVID, minus the scenario where there is COVID, but there's no policy response, the difference of those are the policy response. So the difference of the Gini there is well attributed to the policy response effect. So this is a relatively intuitive decomposition framework. The idea here is we need 3 different income distributions. We need the income distribution just before the initial COVID-19 outbreak and the lockdown, which in the case of Australia, that's pretty much January and February. And we also need income distribution after the initial COVID outbreak in order to measure the impact. In Australia, that's mostly March, April, May, June in this particular study. March is a special month, meaning that some of the policies were not taking place, some of the transmissions were started, so it's a mixed bag. So probably our main focus should be April onwards. And another income distribution we need in order to do the decomposition is to estimate what would happen after the initial outbreak without policy interventions and during the same period from March to June. But this is a scenario we don't observe, so we have to construct this somehow. So in our case, these are three scenarios. We need the data from February, need the data from March, April, May, June, and also the alternative scenario, none of them is available directly. So what's available in Australia? So the existing data for estimated income distribution in Australia primarily come from household HUDA data, which is the household income labor dynamic in Australia, which is an annual survey, a comprehensive household survey collected annually. And another is the survey of income housing published by the ABS, which is a biannual survey. And both surveys, the last release were 2018 data. So that means it doesn't really capture anything happening during the COVID period. So what can we do? A few options we can explore. First option is we can wait for the new data release. So there are some ongoing data collection work, and potentially data will be released in a year or potentially 2 years that capture the pre-COVID income distribution and post-COVID income distribution. However, there might be some issues that the collection going on right now have a mix of responses responded to the questionnaires before COVID and some of them afterwards, which means the number of observations you would have in those surveys to estimate income distribution would be less than what you normally have. And also because of the duration of the survey, you may not actually capture the immediate effect of COVID. What you captured is probably throughout the whole year or throughout the 2 years period. So that's one option that will wait for the data release might be a bit too slow for a lot of the policy decisions. And the second option is to simulate the shock stochastically. We know that some people have lost their job. For instance, if we know that 10% of people lost their jobs, we can say randomly assign the 10% of the unemployed people into unemployment based on the comprehensive household data set like HUDA or PSI. And then we look at what would be the impact of the distribution. This is an approach taken by some of the preliminary analysis in Europe at the moment. And one of the issues with this type of approach is, as we mentioned in the very first slide, the shocks may not be applied evenly. We don't know who are the people more likely to be affected by this particular shock or who are less likely affected. We may have an intuition to say who might be, but we don't have any empirical evidence to back up that directly. So what's the alternative? Another approach is to reconstruct the income distribution from multiple data sources with the up-to-date information, which is the approach that we opted for this particular paper. Although we don't have the real-time household income data, but we do have access to some data. And one of the primary data is the ABS longitudinal labor force survey. It is a survey that is collected monthly, and it covers about 50,000 people. So it's a monthly survey at unit record. It's also the basis of the survey that estimates the unemployment rate by ABS. And that particular data set is updated monthly. So that reflects a lot of the changes in the labor market conditions, looking at whether the people are still working, how many hours they work, what type of jobs they have, etc. However, it does not collect any income information. It is not as comprehensive as PSI or HUDA for that matter. And another source of information published by the ABS is the weekly payroll data collected for the administrative purpose of ATO. Those have the automatic data linked to the tax office, reporting how many jobs are available at a particular industry, occupation, and even at the region, a particular area or age group, and also what's the change of the average pay rate. And that's administrative data, which is also published weekly, and that has a lot of information which could contain some of the information about the COVID impact. Another data we talk about is PSI and HUDA. It is true that those data has outdated labor market characteristics, and clearly that was reflecting only the society by that time. However, there are some conditional income distribution information that we might use. For instance, we know that if I were working in a restaurant, my pay is probably lower than if I have a government job. For instance, the relative income distribution is still stored in that data, although it is not up to date. However, the conditional income distribution, that means the conditional on your working hours, conditionally on your occupation and industry, we still have some valid income distribution information, because those things may not have changed so rapidly after COVID, because the union hasn't had the time to renegotiate a contract, nor there's any change of the minimum wage. So those short-term conditional wage rate may have not changed much. Those information are partially captured by the data set, which we might use. If you think about it, we don't observe the Australian society directly. However, those three data sets can be understood as the projection of what's currently going on. The projection on the labor force survey focuses on the employment characteristics with extensive and intensive margin change. And the projection on the payroll data reflects the changes in the payment, the wage rate on the market. And the survey of income housing and HUDA, those data set will still provide a conditional income distribution information, which is still relevant to the society today. Now, the key thing is, how do we actually combine those information to construct a realistic income distribution? So general idea is we incorporate the observed changes in intensive and extensive margins of the labor market. By intensive, extensive, we mean the number of working hours, and also means of the people, whether they are in the job or not in the job. And we have those observed changes from the labor force survey, and we try to incorporate that information into the survey of income housing, which will only use the conditional income distribution. So to do that, we can reweight different segments of the income distribution to create a counterfactual distribution. This is a method pioneered by DiNardo back in 1996. So from psi and to reweight that into that distribution that resembles the labor force survey. So if you look at the equation I put in there, so intuitively what this means that if a characteristic is more likely to observed in the labor force survey but not psi, that means it has recently changed to be more popular. For instance, people working at reduced hours, people working at 10 hours per week, for instance. And the people who are having those characteristics should increase their weight in the distribution. And the people who are actually becoming less popular, for instance, people working full-time, those people would reduce their weight in the income distribution. And estimating this directly it's more complicated. You may have the issues with the curse of the dimensionalities, depending on your what you included in the personal characteristics. So you can do a transformation there, which is you flip the conditionality using the Bayesian rule, and what you have is you have another term which is normally presented as a prior, and in this case, because we have two, so it's the ratio, not the prior. So the prior is generally in this case is just the size of the sample and the labor force survey and survey of income housing. And since our interest is to estimate those probability conditional probability distributions, those can be estimated by the standard problem. And the number of characteristics can be used in order to approximate the distribution. So the things we use include the demographic characteristics. That means we have age, gender, marital status, whether you're born overseas, etc. And we have a number of employment characteristics, looking at which industry you're in, which occupation you're in, the employment status, whether full-time, part-time, what type of employment you have, whether you're working for a family business or you're a sole trader, what's the euro hours of working you have, what number of jobs you currently hold, and the duration of unemployment if you are unemployed, and all those things interact with the demographic characteristics, because we know there's a chance that the shock is not evenly distributed within the same industry, because depending on the demographic groups. And we also include a bunch of household characteristics, look at the number of kids at the different age groups, which stayed in an end to reflect the differences in the distribution. So in the general idea here is we capture the joint distribution of the demographics, the employment characteristics, and the household characteristics, and to reflect the changes of the labor market characteristics, as well as the changes of the other characteristics from the labor force survey. And so once we have done this step, we'll be able to have a new income distribution. But we didn't stop there. We still do some refinement in order to make the income a bit more accurate. So for wage income, we apply some adjustments using the average weekly earning to index the wage income between 2018 and February 2020. And from February 2020 onwards, we use the payroll data to actually index the wage to reflect changes in the wage level conditional on the industry and the age between February and June. And so that reflects the volatilities and the changes in the wage income since COVID. And we also make some changes to the investment income due to there were some financial volatilities since the COVID has started. So between 2018 and 2020, the February, we just applied 2.5 real return on top of the CPI to adjust the investment income. After that, we use the Australian Super's default portfolio performance index between February and June to reflect the volatility of the investment income. The reason why we didn't use the stock market index, for an example, is not all investment would go into the stock market. The same thing, not all investment would be in a high risk profile, not all investment would be in a low risk profile. And default portfolio present a mix of those things, including the overseas investment. So that gives a nice mixture to reflect the return of the investment. And this is how it looks like. So from January onwards, we see a slight increase of the investment returns, and then there's a big decline in March, April period, and it slowly recovers since then. So if you have investment return in April or May, chances are it's much lower than what it could have been in February. So this has been taken into account in our model. And the rest of the incomes and also some of the expenses were indexed by the consumer price index. We also indexed the childcare expense because we want to actually exclude childcare expense in the disposable income calculation later due to the variation into the childcare policy. So we have the gross income now. What we need to do is to translate that into disposable income and they estimate what actually changes due to the tax and transfer system response. So a number of policies were announced since March, and most of them are implemented in April onwards. So this includes a one-off economic support payment for some of the welfare recipients. If you earn certain benefits, you may get a one-off payment to your bank account. And there are also temporarily increased welfare payments to certain welfare recipients, like the unemployment benefit receivers. And there are also some temporary changes in the welfare payment rules, and the notable ones including the suspension of the asset testings, and there's taper rate change. The taper rate here controls how much your unemployment benefit would be if your partner still works, right? So because the higher income as your partner, the less you receive from the unemployment benefit. And another major change is the relaxing requirement for the unemployment benefit, which is a job seeker in Australia. So normally, if you want to apply for unemployment benefit, you need to show that you're actually looking for jobs. Due to COVID, that requirement is temporarily suspended. So during the few months period, you don't have to show that you're actually actively looking for jobs. That means unemployment benefit are given to the people with a broader range of the people than it would normally have been. Maybe that's also one of the reasons that contributed to the surge of the recipients of the unemployment benefit. Another change is the childcare. Childcare became fully subsidized between April and June for approximately 3 months to support the childcare centres. Childcare is usually subsidized through the childcare subsidy in Australia, depending on your family income. And So for during that period of the time, a childcare subsidy is temporarily 100%. You can think of it as 100% if you send your kid. And another major change is the wage subsidy, which is also called JobKeeper in Australia, for businesses with substantial losses in turnover. So the business who suffers substantial loss, and instead of the government intention is instead of them firing the people or letting them go, and they keep the position and the wage as up to $1,500 per week is fully paid, per fortnight is fully paid by the government. And they pay the employer, and the employer transfer the JobKeeper payment into the employees. And it is independent to how much you previously earned, as long as you have been there for over a year. So that means if you're working full time, so chances are you have a reduced wage rate. And if you work there only for casual for 4 hours a week, for instance, chances are you actually have a decent pay increase because the JobKeeper program is a flat rate. So most of these policy changes are straightforward from Stimulus Plus, because actually Stimulus Plus is already encoded all the tax and transfer system change. It is a microsimulation models we use at NASAM to model the tax system. But there are a few other things that are relatively more complex. The first thing is the wage subsidy. So to simulate to estimate a disposable income, we need to know whether someone belongs to the receiving the wage subsidy. And if the intention of the wage subsidy is to keep those who are at risk, we actually can identify those using the longitudinal variation of the labor force survey. So the labor force survey is also in the longitudinal format, which you can actually see who have been previously working and who has lost their job. So we'll be able to estimate the conditional distributions on who most likely to lose their job in the next months also. And we align it to about 3.5 million individuals, as per the Treasury reviewers saying that about approximately 3 million people were receiving the JobKeeper payment. The other change is the unemployment benefit eligibility criteria change. As I mentioned earlier, the people who apply for unemployment benefit not necessarily looking for jobs at that time. So again, because we actually know their employment trajectories over time, so we actually know who has been recently employment, even if they are currently out of the labor force. We can estimate that the conditional distribution again using the longitudinal variations, and we can apply this distribution into the nowcast data set to simulate the distribution of the unemployment benefit, the broadened unemployment benefit eligibility. So combining all this, what we can do is we can get the income distribution just before the COVID-19 initial outbreak and the lockdown. By combining these three data sets, all the information from February, we'll be able to construct that. And we'll also be able to construct income distribution after the initial COVID outbreak. So we just rerun the models again in March, again in April, May, June, as long as there is sufficient data to support it. And another distribution we need, as we mentioned earlier, is the income distribution after the initial outbreak without the policy intervention. And that is more challenging. It is challenging because we don't know what happens if the policy interventions is absent. And that depends on how much you think the behavior response would be. Would the JobKeeper, if there were no JobKeeper, for instance, would those jobs be gone, or actually nothing happens to those job positions? The business will continue as usual. So instead of placing a strong assumption there, we actually estimate a range. We've estimated a lower bound and upper bound rather than providing a point estimate. So the lower bound, which is also sometimes referred as the low impact estimates, is when the no job losses, should there be no interventions. So even if the government doesn't provide job keepers, still the business will continue as usual. This is clearly not realistic, but again, this gives it a lower bound. And the upper bound estimate will be all subsidized jobs will be gone. So if there was no subsidy, all of those jobs will be turned into unemployment. And that gives you an upper bound of the maximum impact of this could be. So the truth will be somewhere in between. And in our case, we provide the bound. We show that actually the result is robust regardless which bound you use. Now we move on to the results section. So the results will first discuss about validations of this particular income distribution we reconstructed, and then we talk about market income change, we talk about disposable income change, and we talk about income inequality and poverty. So we first start with the validation, because if the income distribution is not right, it's not meaningful to discuss any of the results further. So what are we looking for here? So right now on the screen, what I plotted is some of the key demographic characteristics extracted from the labor force survey and also extracted from SCI, and they look fairly similar. So the difference is probably due to the sampling difference, and also there's a small difference over time, right? Because one is 2018, but one is 2020. But again, the difference is very small. So what would we expect from our model? So if the algorithm works and our income distribution is reasonable, our distribution is generally reasonable, what do we expect? We have the similar result with all of them. It wouldn't trying to align with a particular labor market metrics at the cost of the demographic distortions in the demographic distributions. And this is what we actually observed. So the gray bar is what we have in the modeled section, generally falls in between with the labor force survey and survey of income housing. And this shows that there's hardly any change in the demographic characteristics. Demographic aside, which we want it to be stable, and at the same time, we want some of the characteristics not stable, in the sense that it should be sensitive to the changes, and notably the labor market change. And what's on the screen is the unemployment rate from the ABS data, and clearly shows an increase since February. And we want our distribution shows an increase in the unemployment rate as well. If it doesn't, means that the distribution is too stagnant with a particular point in time. It's not sensitive enough to do the estimation. And this is what we get. So you can see that you look at the one on the left, look at the unemployment rate. We're actually very close to the official figure, and most importantly, we shows up the upward trend. The biggest gap is in June. We will overshoot the metrics a bit. And similar story with the youth unemployment. We generally get in the same range of the official statistics, except in June we have overshoot that slightly. But to think about it, each model is estimated, each month is estimated independently. We did not impose any temporal correlation in the estimation. So this is the results from different months. It can partially consider it as a robustness, as another test, is another independent run. So generally our range is quite close to what we want. So this shows that the distribution is sensitive to the changes in employment rate. That's what we can actually use this to derive the further income distribution. Another thing we want to look at is the estimated propensity of dropping out of employment conditioned on being employed in the previous months. This helps us to understand what are the main changes in the employment market, and it also helps us to understand how that's distributed at the different income level. It helps us to understand the potential change at both gross income and the disposable income later. So we start by looking at the February data. If you're on the bottom 20% on the labor market in terms of a wage, chances are you have approximately 2.5% chance that you will lose your job in February if you had a job in January. And that probability goes down as you become the more higher income earner. And so this is considered as a baseline before COVID. So this is what happens. Now let's see what happens after the COVID. Since the COVID shock, we see a dramatic increase in the propensity of dropping out of employment, and most notably for the people who are on the bottom 20% of the gross market income quintile. So you can see that the highest is observed in April. So if you had a job in March, the chance you lose your job in April, if you earn very on the bottom 20% of the market income quintile, is actually very high. There's more than 10% chance that you might lose your job. And even if you're actually on the higher end of the income distribution, this say Q4 and Q5, you're looking at a similar risk profile as the Q1 back in February. although it is still much lower than the bottom quintile, but it's still substantially raised compared with the baseline, which is February. And it does go down slightly as we progress in further. So the May, June slightly recovered. The shock was no longer as dramatic as in April. However, it is still much higher than the baseline. So from this, what we expect, there are probably a lot of people are losing their jobs when the Q1. So there will be more changes in the extensive margins here, and there are probably less changes in the employment characteristics in the higher end of the income distribution. So let's examine the changes in the market income by put that into households. So we look at the changes in the market income by pre-COVID equivalized household disposable income quintile. So there are multiple factors that help in there in order to get to the total gross income. So one thing is whether you have your job or not. The other thing is how many hours you work. And another factor is whether the job subsidy applies to you. So you can see in baseline in March, there's hardly any change, and it shows it's relatively stable there. But once we enter April, May, June, those have a similar profile. The bottom 20% of the households would actually experience an increase of the gross market income. By gross market income, we refer to the wage, business, and investment income only, and it's only the reflection of the mean of this particular group of households. You can see that although they actually lost their jobs, a lot of people lost their jobs, their average gross market income has actually increased. And this is mostly due to the wage subsidy that's offered to them. And the benefit of that actually gradually declines. And Q2 and Q3 still benefit from them, from roughly an increase by the 5% of their gross market income, and for the highest 20% of the household, there's hardly any change in the gross market income. Another thing worth to note is, although the increase is more dramatic in the bottom 20%, their baseline is also much lower. Their average market income is much lower, so a relatively small change would still show up a relatively high change, percentage-wise. So how much of this were contributed by the income shock and how much of this were contributed by the policy response, notably the job keeper on the gross income side? So that depends on where you believe the counterfactual simulation should lie. What would be the behavior response be? So if you don't believe the market would lose a lot of jobs, you believe all jobs will be fine, even without job keeper, chances are you don't think the income shock will be the primary driver of it. And that corresponds to the numerically the higher value of the estimate of the income shock effect. And this corresponds to the lower end of the estimate of the policy response effect, which you can see is around in ballpark around 20-some% increase for Q1. These were contributed by the policy response, most notably the job keeper program. However, if you believe that without the job keeper, most of those jobs will be gone, or all of those jobs will be gone, this will give you the lower bound of the estimate, numerically the lower one of the estimate. And because they all add up to the total actual observed change, and this will be the upper bound of the policy response effect. So we're looking at, so the changes of the gross income in Q1, the approximately 20 to 40% were contributed by the policy response, and minus 20% to 0% roughly contributed by the income shock effect for Q1. And for the rest of the quintile, we can also do the same calculations, and you can see that for the policy response is gradually declining as the income goes higher. You see at the highest 20% of the household, the policy response can control for between 1% to 15%-ish of the impact, and in the Q1 that would have contributed to 23 to 40-some% for the Q1. And the income shock effect is actually more evident around the Q2 to Q4. Those people actually are working. So Q1 has a lot of households living with the primary income from welfare payment. So they actually may be less affected by the labor market policy. So in this case, you can see their drop is, the gross income drop is actually, even the worst case will be smaller than the worst case in Q2, Q3, or Q4. And these are the primary wage earners. And for Q5, because they have a lower risk, so their impact is also relatively smaller compared with the rest of the quintile. So how does this translate into disposable income? If you look at the disposable income change, similar to the gross income, the largest beneficiary is the Q1, and the increase will actually gradually decline, and with the Q5, it was hardly any change. And what contributes to the net results of the disposable income? If we break it down to the changes due to the gross income, the changes due to the free childcare, and changes due to the welfare policy and the interactions, what you can see that for Q1, the major component that contribute to the change is actually the welfare policy change. That means the one-off supplements, that means the increase in employment benefit, and all those kind of measures. And the gross income, which captures the job keeper, the wage subsidy, is relatively limited. It's up to only 5% change into the disposable income. And the benefits gradually declines for the gross income components. And also for the total ones, it declines. For Q5, you actually see a small drop in the gross income. And the patterns from between April and June are relatively similar. And if we standardize this to 100%, it probably shows clearer which component is more important. The quintiles are more relying on the gross income. The Q2 to Q4 probably have a higher portion of their change were contributed by the gross income change. Childcare free childcare helps, but it's a relatively small component. Welfare is the dominating part for the Q1 and the Q2 disposable income change. And similarly, we do a table that shows the lower bound impacts, which is you have a very small income shock effect and relatively small policy response. In fact, you can see that the policy response is very progressive in the case of the COVID. And the upper bound of the impact here, this actual bound is relatively narrow. The policy response is contribute to 23 to say 28% of the changes to the Q1, and it gradually drops to 0 to 14% change to Q5. You have this table in the paper as well if you're interested. So what happens to the income inequality change? So as a background information, Australian Gini is usually around 0.3 to 0.33, that ballpark range, a bit above 0.3. And it's primarily driven by the market income shocks and policy change. So we have a recent paper looking at that, the accumulated change in Gini since 2002. And this is just you can see that the market income components over about 15 years time, it only contribute in total the change about 0.01 to 0.02 changes in Gini, disposable income Gini in Australia, and the policy actually negates that change. And there's a residual which is capture the behavior response and the interactions of the terms. So let's see what happened in Australia. Well, we can start from the market income. So because of the introduction of the wage job keepers, we actually have a relatively stable gross income profiles. From February to June, the Gini of the wage business investment income for the people aged between 15 and 64 has only increased slightly. I mean, compared with this is actually a very high base. This is a gross income. And of those changes, about 0.02 to 0.14 was contributed by the income shock effect from COVID. And these are almost entirely negated by the policy effects due to the introduction of the wage subsidy into the market. Because of that, and because of the additions in the welfare policy, what we see in the disposable income inequality is a relatively sharp drop. Between February to June, we actually see a drop of up to 0.03 in Gini, which is substantial given that the annual changes usually less than a third of that. And on the left-hand side, which is our lower bound estimates of the impact, which you can see this drop of the Gini was contributed mainly by the policy effect. And there is an income shock effect would have increased the Gini if there were no policy intervention. In the upper bound estimates, the similar story, except the income shock effect is much higher because we think this is the upper bound estimate of the maximum impact on the labor market. So a lot of people would have lost their jobs. So the income shock effect would have been higher, and conversely, the policy impact again still dominates the income shock effect, leading up to the reduction of the Gini. Since we know that there's an increase of the disposable income, especially in the bottom 2 quintiles, it's probably not surprising to see there's actually a drop of the poverty rate if we hold the poverty line constant. So from between February and May, June, we actually expect a drop of the poverty, about a few percentage drop. And this is in a stark contrast if we actually don't have any policy intervention, the poverty rate will be somewhere between these. Chances are somewhere here. We will definitely see an increase of the poverty rate without those those policy measures. And in the worst case, we can go up to more than 20% of the poverty. To conclude, we use a new method in constructing a near real-time income distribution in Australia. We do that by semi-parametrically combining multiple incomplete data. So those older data are close to real, 2 of them are close to real time. So we combine those information to construct a real-time income distribution. And we use that to estimate inequality change in Australia. We find that inequality in gross income has generally been stable, despite a significant shock introduced by COVID-19. Since the bottom quintile has a significant rise in the disposable income, so Australia has experienced a rapid drop in income inequality, reducing the Gini from 0.33 to just above 0.3, which is much higher than the typical change in a year, and also higher than the change actually in the GFC. The poverty rate, which could have increased by more than 10 percentage points in this case, and in absence of the government response, has also reduced by 3 to 4 percentage points, thanks to most of the policy measures. But that's also raised another point is most of those changes are heavily dependent on the temporary measures, and those measures may be withdrawn at some point, or some of them has already started to be withdrawn. And this actually, all the changes in income inequality may be reversed, or potentially even worse, and going to be one of those absent of the policy scenarios. And so that would be something that we will watch out for and to look at a midterm and the long-term impact of COVID on the income distribution. Thank you, and this is the reference of it if you want to download the full paper to see the full text, and we welcome any of the comments. Thank you. Yuki, now I give it to you.
Thank you, Jinjing, for a very rich and rigorous and innovative presentation. Look, I would encourage people to submit questions in the Q&A, which is to the right-hand side of the bar on your screen, and we'll publish those and share them with Jinjing. We have our first question from John Hawkins. Thank you, John, for submitting your question. I'm conscious, Jinjing, that this is something that looks at information between February and June. It's not something that's looking forward in its design, and we have a budget coming, and future government policy settings are unknown. However, there has been an intent shown to remove the JobKeeper and JobKeeper supplements over time. And John's question is around what can the calculations tell us about what's likely to happen to income distribution and poverty if the government does continue with its plan to remove the payments?
So if you look at so if I look at the change in the poverty rate, for instance, and this is what we currently observe, and this is what will happen without any of the policy response. Withdrawing some of the policy basically means move this line a bit upwards. We will probably expect an increase of the poverty rate, given that much of the income in the bottom, especially the bottom 20% of the household, depend on the temporary measures, increase the temporary measures. We haven't done a calculation on exactly what the impact would be, but that my speculation it will be somewhere the poverty rate would increase and inequality would increase in that case. Yeah.
And one of the things that we've been discussing is the potential to track that using this methodology in coming months to see exactly what the impact is of policy changes over the next 6 months to 12 months. While we're waiting for further questions, in the paper, Jinjing, you describe the methodologies nowcasting and that it's been inspired in some part by work done in Europe, in Italy, England and Ireland. Can you reflect on some of the similarities and differences between the work that we've done here in Australia with the work using nowcasting with COVID in Europe?
Right. So every nowcast method applied is different. So every paper is different in that sense. So in the absence of the real data, some nowcast method uses trying to impose an assumption what will likely to happen. So for instance, we're gonna draw a random number to see who will be employed and who will not be employed. And in our case, we are lucky enough to actually see the observed changes thanks to the longitudinal labor force survey. So instead of making that assumption, we can actually draw on the real data and to incorporate that information into the nowcast model. We still need a bit of the assumptions because we don't observe the entire picture. We observe partial picture, but still we would compare with some of the nowcast, we will actually impose less assumptions because they're reliant on the observed changes. Yeah.
Thank you. We've had another question that's come through, and it's and again, I note that the paper's not seeking to make policy recommendations. It's a paper that's, I suppose, one of its findings is the impact of government policy decisions and the noticeable change. Do you have a sense of what policy recommendations the government could or should be considering?
I think probably the useful base is to actually trying to model, to actually try to estimate what would the likely change of the policy impact before the implementation of the policy. Regardless what the policy that's going to be implemented, there's always a policy goal, either to, for instance, trying to maintain the current income distribution, or we're trying to prevent an increase of the poverty rate. And this method and also this approach of the work we have done will help you to shine some light on what's actually currently going on in Australia. So that may help you to understand what will also the likely impact of the potential policy proposal there. We don't have any specific policy recommendation in the sense that's really driven by the policy goal, but I think this method and also the paper would be useful to understand the potential impact of whatever the policies that may be considering.
No, thank you, Jinjing, and I'd encourage people to submit their questions. We have one from Robert Tanton. Have we seen a difference in impact by state and territory, family type or age group?
I would expect there are differences, although we haven't done the analysis explicitly to do that. We can potentially have a look at the differences across the state and various family type and age groups as well. This particular paper focusing on the overall income distribution. We probably can follow up with some more analysis focusing on a subpart of the population. Yeah.
Okay, and just following up on the theme about the differences with other nowcasting approaches. The contribution of StinMod Plus, how did that change? How did that, do you believe, enhance the capacity of the sorts of things that could be achieved through this methodology that we perhaps haven't seen through methodologies elsewhere?
Well, so we're looking at the income distribution of the disposable income. So to estimate the disposable income, we need to know what policies are in place in order to convert the gross income. So for this kind of exercise, once there is a policy, tax and transfer system change, we would need some sort of a model in order to estimate that. And in this case, we use StinMod Plus because we have access to the model, and so we use that in order to do that task. Yeah.
Excellent. just waiting to see if further questions coming through. In relation to the Gini coefficient, I understand that the change due to the policy intervention was significantly larger than what we would normally expect with the transition over a similar period of time. To what extent was the size of that difference?
Well, in this case, because of a lot of the measures that are put up by the government is highly progressive. So these are the additional progressive policy measures that we didn't observe before, and they were all introduced in a very short period of time. And this causes a rapid bump of the income for the bottom 20%, and maybe even 40% of the household. That's why we see the reduction of the income inequality, because the policy doesn't do much for the top 20% of the people. So narrowing the gap between the top and the bottom. That's why we see a relatively large change.
Okay. Well, I think in the absence of any other questions to ask, I'd like to thank you for that presentation. I think it's absolutely it's very impressive the work that's been done, and I think it's a significant contribution to the public debate as this topic of policy change in response to COVID and the various payments is being conducted. I'd like to particularly encourage people, having had the chance to see this presentation and reflect upon it, if they have questions or comments around the working paper, please provide that feedback. As I said at the introduction at the start, one of the purposes of this is to seek feedback from the community around the contribution and the approach to this research, and I know that Jinjing would absolutely welcome correspondence to him. And there we go, exactly what I was after, Jinjing, thank you. And that's the link to the working paper if you've not had the opportunity to download it so far, and Jinjing's email address so that you can contact him with those comments and feedback and questions. So with that in mind, I'd like to again thank Jinjing. I'd like to thank Yogi for his support in the moderation role, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I'm just checking to see if there may have been a final question. Robert wants to know when the video will be available. That I'm not actually sure. That might be one. Yogi, can you assist us with that question?
So yeah, basically after this, for those who are linked through the MS Teams can directly get the link, but for those who link up through Chrome or other browser, then I can download it for you and make it available in NetSum website, or even send it by email or something.
Okay. So we should be able to make it available in the next 24 hours.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So again, we encourage you to visit the working paper, perhaps look at the presentation again, and please get back into contact with us in relation to this paper. And as I mentioned earlier, follow NetSum on Twitter, sorry, so that you can be aware of more online research presentation seminars in the future. So again, thank you, Jinjing, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.